How can this stand? Bogle wrote this book quite a few years ago, and it passed without a ripple. The employees of banks stuff the shareholders. The winning banks stuff the losing banks. The winning banks and the losing banks stuff both the wholesale customers and the retail customers, and they all stuff the central banks and governments and taxpayers when anything goes wrong. It's a glorious game, except that it doesn't work to get an economy going, because all of that money could have gone into real industry. And it could have grown companies, but it hasn't. And even within the financial services industry, let's look at old Lehman. We thought they were a trading giant. I was so respectful of Lehman. I thought it was a fantastic organization. What was it? A stuffy. AIG. We thought they were a daring counterparty. You know, the only people who would offer one side of a trade on those super seniors. Well, there was a reason, because those super seniors were a bunch of horse manure. Merrill, solid investment bank. No, it wasn't. It was the stuffy from Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And in fact, we all knew that all along. We saw Merrill on the wrong side of the trade, year after year after year. Northern Rock, well, forget about it. The continental European banks, very important for you to understand in Germany. For decades, the American banks that I would advise would talk about the Landesbank and other second-tier European banks as the place to stuff lousy securities. They couldn't originate, they didn't know how to originate, so they just had to sit downstream and from New York, Citicorp or whoever, or JP Morgan would say, we've just originated a loan with these people over here. Your share is 5%, and you will be getting 3 basis points in margin. Thank you very much. And ultimately, if you're stuffy, everything goes wrong, even if you're only accepting 3 basis points. And that did happen. And that hurt your economy very significantly here by the Landesbank and others being significant stuffies. Now, another really important thing to understand is that CEO pay, 1960, CEOs got 30 times as much as the average worker in America. By 2008, they were getting 475 times as much. Japan only 11 times. In Germany, only 12 times. Now, that's why things didn't go so badly wrong here. But what was happening, it was they have this phrase in America, you're somebody's enabler. Where, if somebody's a drug addict, you're their enabler because you support them while they go off and get their drugs. Well, the CEOs and the banks were co-enablers, because the equity analysts who worked for the banks would write about how this was a fantastic company, and the CEO was deserving of 475 times as much as anybody else, $50 million a year, whatever. And then the CEO would pay huge fees to the investment bank for all these important things they were doing, like writing equity reports about them. And so it wasn't just the banks. And again, what happened to the shareholders, to the institutional investors, to the regulators? Why didn't they stop this sort of utterly absurd payment? Because it all ended in tears. Everybody said for years it's going to end in tears, and everybody who said that was sort of kicked out of their jobs or sidelined or whatever, and it did end in tears. Okay, so was it the banks that did it? Yes. Had they escaped retribution? Yes. There have been a few scapegoats, but it's mostly the same leadership. Is there any sign they've changed their behavior? No. There was this talk earlier about, well, we can't possibly have the same crash in the same way as we had before. I'm not so sure, because things are much the same. We are all still outside the banking industry behaving as stuffies, and the banks are still behaving as stuffers. The big 4 banks now approach true oligopoly status. The big 4 banks in America, JP Morgan, Citicorp, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they have about 50% of the market, or they've got over 50% of all mortgages. They've got 2/3 of all credit cards. When you've only got 4 competitors in a market, they can start charging massive fees. What's been done to prevent this all happening again? I would argue very little. It really doesn't seem that way. So what's the medium-term outlook?